It was supposed to be a peaceful Saturday morning. The kind of morning you want to freeze in time, where everything feels right. The sun was shining just the right amount. Not too hot, but warm enough to make the whole neighborhood glow. Birds were singing in the trees. The faint hum of sprinklers could be heard, and somewhere, down the street, the steady rhythm of a lawnmower. It felt like a perfect morning, like everything was in its place. My son, Ethan, was out in the driveway, doing what he loved best, creating. He had a small box of chalk and was busy drawing what he called his sidewalk masterpiece. A giant T-Rex, so bright in colours it could have been straight out of a cartoon, with lightning bolts shooting from its eyes as it fought off aliens. I could hear him, his little voice calling to me as he proudly pointed at his drawing. "Look, Dad, he's fighting aliens. See the green guys?" There was that excitement in his voice, that joy that only a kid could have when they create something out of nothing. I couldn't help but smile as I sat there, enjoying the moment, thinking about how simple life was, how easy it was to love a day like this. I had a moment of peace, and I thought maybe, just maybe, the world was still a good place. But of course, that's when it all started to go wrong. You know, they always say that's how it happens, the calm before the storm. I heard it before I saw it, the sound of tires rolling slowly down the street. It wasn't the usual fast-paced sound of cars rushing by. No, this was different. It was slower, deliberate. Something about it felt off, like they were drawing closer, getting ready to make a move. I looked up from my spot on the porch, instinctively narrowing my eyes against the sun. And then I saw it. A matte black SUV, creeping down the road with tinted windows that were so dark you couldn't see a thing inside. No license plate on the front. It wasn't just any car. This was a vehicle that didn't belong, a vehicle that was too quiet, too still. And it rolled to a stop right in front of our house. I don't know what it was, but something about it, how it just parked there, how it seemed to watch us. It sent a chill up my spine. My instincts kicked in, and I stood up, already feeling the tension building in my gut. Before I could reach for my phone, the doors of the SUV opened in perfect synchronization. 2 men stepped out. I took a quick mental note. Neither one of them looked like they belonged. Their outfits were off. Navy blue uniforms with bold white letters across the chest reading HOA enforcement. No badges, no name tags, no real insignia from any official department I'd ever seen. I could feel my pulse quicken as I looked at them. One was tall and lean, with mirrored sunglasses, and the other was stockier, wearing black tactical gloves in the middle of a Texas summer. The first one was holding a clipboard, the kind you use for official forms, but the second one, he had zip ties hanging from his belt. Now, I'm no expert in law enforcement, but this wasn't adding up. They didn't look like cops. They didn't act like cops. They looked like a couple of thugs who decided to play dress-up. But I had no idea what they were playing at. "Can I help you?" I called out, keeping my voice calm, but I was already moving between them and Ethan, just in case. I wasn't sure who these guys were, but I wasn't about to let them get any closer to my son without finding out. The taller man didn't answer right away. Instead, he just pointed down at Ethan's chalk drawing. "This is defacement," he said flatly, his voice cold, like he had all the authority in the world. I blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "Sidewalk markings are against HOA code 7A14, the stockier guy added, stepping a little closer. "Graffiti vandalism, grounds for an immediate citation." Citation? For chalk. I stared at them in disbelief. Ethan was just a kid, not some criminal. He was sitting on the ground, barely old enough to tie his own shoes, much less deface anything. I turned to look at Ethan, who had frozen, clutching his chalk in his tiny hands. "Mom, what's going on?" he whispered, his voice trembling, My heart twisted at the sight of him. That's when I felt my instincts flare. I stepped forward, putting myself firmly between Ethan and these two men. "This is just Chalk," I said, my voice firm but steady. "He's 9 years old." My words hung in the air for a second, but neither of them seemed to care. The tall one didn't even flinch. Instead, he pulled out a phone from his pocket and started filming. "You're interfering with an enforcement action, ma'am," he said, like he was some kind of cop. I shook my head. "What enforcement action? You're not even real officers." That's when the stocky one pulled out the zip ties, and I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't about some stupid HOA violation. It wasn't about Chalk. These men were up to something else entirely. Before I could say another word, the stocky man lunged forward. His hand shot out, quick as lightning, grabbing my phone right out of my hand. "Tampering with evidence," he sneered. "That's obstruction." I couldn't believe what was happening. My pulse raced, and everything inside me screamed to grab Ethan and run. But as I turned to look at him, he was still sitting there, scared, holding on to that piece of chalk like it was his lifeline. I could feel the fear rising in my chest, but then I heard something. It was slow at first, the creak of a door opening from behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around, and there, stepping out onto the porch, was my father, Frank. I didn't have to say anything. I didn't even have to call out for help. My father, my rock, was there, and the moment he stepped out, I exhaled. I didn't know what he was going to do, but I knew it was going to be something that would make these men rethink whatever it was they thought they were doing. Frank didn't rush. He didn't even break a sweat. He just walked down the steps and into the front yard with a calm that was unnerving. He didn't look at me, didn't ask questions. He simply sized up the situation. The two fake officers hadn't noticed him at first, but I did. When they finally saw him, the tall one scoffed, saying something like, "Stay back, old man. This doesn't concern you." Frank didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just looked at the two of them, and in the quietest voice I'd ever heard, he said something that made everything freeze in place. "The last man you'll ever intimidate." The words hung in the air, and there was something in his tone, something unspoken, that made the two men pause. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a challenge. It was a statement of fact. I knew it, and I could see it in their eyes. They knew it too. They might have thought they were in charge, but Frank had just made it clear that they were way out of their depth. That was the moment everything changed. For a brief moment, there was silence. The two fake officers, stunned by Frank's words, seemed to hesitate. They looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. The stocky one, still holding the zip ties, shifted on his feet, his eyes darting between Frank and me. The taller thug adjusted his sunglasses and sneered, his posture defensive now, like he was trying to figure out if Frank was just some old man who'd forgotten his place, or if there was something more to him. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I watched this unfold. I knew my dad. I knew what he was capable of, but I couldn't help but wonder if these two guys would back off, or if they'd escalate the situation. My instincts told me this wasn't just some random run-in. These guys didn't pull up in a dark SUV and start threatening my kid for a sidewalk chalk drawing unless there was something bigger going on. And now, with Frank standing there was no way I was going to back down. The tension in the air grew thick, almost suffocating. The tall man's eyes flicked to the stocky one, almost as if he was silently trying to gauge whether it was worth it to keep pushing, or if they should just leave. But Frank didn't give them the chance to decide. With a quiet but calculated movement, he took a step forward. It wasn't a lunge, but it was enough to shift the balance of power. I saw the stocky man's hand twitch, like he was preparing to react, but it was too late. Frank was already in motion. The first thing Frank did was simple, but it was precise. He closed the distance between them, stepping inside the taller man's reach. Before the thug could throw a punch or try anything else, Frank grabbed his wrist with one hand and drove the heel of his palm straight into the man's elbow joint. The crack of bone was so loud, it echoed down the street. I watched as the thug's arm snapped backward with a sickening crunch, and he screamed in pain, dropping to his knees, clutching his arm. The second thug, the one with the zip ties, started to charge at Frank, but Frank didn't hesitate. Without even looking, he pivoted, low and fast. He wasn't just reacting, he was in complete control. As the stocky thug raised his hand to strike, Frank swept his legs out from under him with a sharp kick to the back of his knees. The thug crumpled like a sack of bricks, hitting the ground hard. He gasped for air, stunned, his breath coming out in short, panicked bursts. In under 10 seconds, two grown men, two men who had been threatening my son, trying to intimidate us, were on the ground, completely incapacitated. And not once had Frank raised his voice. Not once had he shown any sign of panic. It was like he was dealing with nothing more than a mild inconvenience, something he could handle without breaking a sweat. But what shocked me the most wasn't just how fast it happened. It was how calm Frank stayed. He wasn't angry. He wasn't filled with rage. He was cold, calculating, controlled. I felt my breath catch as I looked down at Ethan, still in my arms, his wide eyes locked on his grandfather, who was now crouching down beside the second thug, the one who was still gasping for air. I pulled Ethan closer to me, holding him tight, but I didn't take my eyes off of Frank. There was no anger in him, no vengeance, just a quiet resolve. He didn't look at the two men on the ground with any emotion. He simply went about his business. He grabbed the zip ties off the stocky man's belt and yanked them free. As he tied the man's hands behind his back, he muttered under his breath, "You like using these on kids?" The thug didn't respond. He was too busy groaning in pain, too dazed to even process what had just happened. Frank worked methodically, almost clinically, tying up the first man and then turning to the second one, who was still groaning on the pavement. There was no hesitation in Frank's movements. He was efficient, like a surgeon performing an operation. His hands didn't shake, his breath didn't quicken. He was exactly who he needed to be in that moment. He had the situation under control. And while the two men on the ground were still trying to come to their senses, Frank was already thinking ahead. He wasn't just reacting to the immediate threat. He was preparing for what came next. I stood there, frozen, watching him. It was like a switch had flipped inside me, and I wasn't just the mom trying to protect her son anymore. I was witnessing something much bigger than that. I knew Frank had seen things in his life. He'd been a soldier, a protector, and he had a way of reading people, of sizing them up and knowing exactly what to do. But I'd never seen him in action like this before. Calm, quiet, but deadlier than anyone could have expected. He stood up slowly, looking down at the two men who were now fully restrained. I could hear their groans as they tried to regain their bearings, but Frank didn't acknowledge them. He simply looked around the street, scanning the area with a practiced eye. And that's when the first neighbor stepped out onto their porch, then another, then a few more. It was like they were slowly starting to realize what had happened, what they'd just witnessed. The first phone appeared, followed by others. People started whispering, some in disbelief, some in awe. "Did you see that? He just took them down like nothing." The whispers spread quickly, and soon, the entire street was alive with the sound of people talking, murmuring about what they'd just seen. Frank was no longer just an old man standing in his yard. He was something else. He was a protector, a force to be reckoned with. I didn't know what to say. My thoughts were racing, but I couldn't form the words. Frank had handled the situation like a pro, like it was nothing, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. But I knew it wasn't over. These men were just the tip of the iceberg. Whoever was behind them was still out there, and I could feel the weight of it. I wanted to keep Ethan safe. I wanted to keep us safe. But something told me this wasn't just some random encounter. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Frank stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the street, watching the neighbors gather, watching them record, watching them whisper. I knew what he was thinking. He wasn't looking for praise. He wasn't looking for recognition. He was looking for threats. He was always 5 steps ahead, always prepared for what came next. And as the first sirens began to wail in the distance, I knew this was only the beginning of what was going to unfold. The police would arrive soon, and the men would be arrested. But Frank wasn't concerned with the immediate aftermath. He knew that what mattered now was making sure no one else would ever try to pull something like this again. The 2 men on the ground were just pawns in a much larger game, and Frank wasn't about to let them, or whoever was behind them, get away with it. He didn't say anything to me, but I could see it in his eyes. We were just getting started. Frank stood there, arms crossed, surveying the scene with an intensity that made everything else feel like background noise. The 2 men on the ground were still groaning, trying to piece together what had just happened to them, but Frank didn't seem concerned. He didn't even look at them. His eyes were scanning the street, watching for any sign that something else was coming. He was calm, too calm, but in that calm, there was a sharpness that let you know he wasn't missing a thing. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me, but I didn't know what to do next. My hands were shaking as I held Ethan close, trying to comfort him, but truthfully, I wasn't sure how to comfort myself. Ethan was still staring at Frank, eyes wide, as if trying to understand what he had just witnessed. The way Frank moved, how effortlessly he had taken down 2 grown men without breaking a sweat, was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. He had done it so fast, so precisely. I wasn't sure if I should be relieved or scared out of my mind. "Are you okay, baby?" I whispered to Ethan, my voice trembling slightly, but he nodded without hesitation. "Mum, Grandpa, he moved like a ninja," he said in a voice that was both amazed and still a little unsure. I hugged him tighter. I couldn't help but laugh softly, even though the gravity of the situation hadn't sunk in completely. Ethan's words were exactly right. Grandpa had moved like a ninja, and in the blink of an eye, these 2 men were down. Frank was already kneeling beside the stocky man, who was still whimpering on the ground. Frank didn't seem to have any pity for him. He was methodical, moving with a purpose. I had seen that look on Frank before, when he was in his element, when he was doing what he knew best. And right now, he was in his element. His hands worked with precision as he untied the zip ties from the thug's belt, the sound of the plastic snapping through the air almost like a soft command. He didn't need to look up at me or say a word. He just moved. He wasn't angry, not even close. He was beyond that. He was controlled. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anything. This was just Frank doing what needed to be done. The second thug was still down on the ground, gasping for air, his body sprawled out like a rag doll. He had tried to make a move earlier, but Frank had already shut him down, leaving him dazed and helpless. As I looked at the 2 of them, I realized just how quickly things had turned. One moment, we were sitting on the porch, and the next, 2 men who thought they could take control of the situation were completely at Frank's mercy. And mercy was something Frank didn't give lightly. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of gratitude mixed with fear. The gratitude was obvious. Frank had stopped whatever they had planned, whatever they were trying to do to us. But the fear came from realizing just how close we had come to losing everything. These weren't just random guys. This wasn't just some small-time scam. Whoever was behind this had resources, had planning, had power. And now they had been exposed. But that didn't mean they were done. Frank didn't wait for anyone to thank him. He didn't expect recognition. He didn't even care. The only thing on his mind was making sure we were safe, and making sure nothing like this ever happened again. He finished tying up the second man's hands and stood up, brushing his hands off like he had just finished a job well done. He didn't look at the two men on the ground, didn't look at me or Ethan. He just turned and walked toward the SUV. By now, the neighbors had gathered in front of their houses, whispering, watching, recording. Frank ignored them all, like he didn't even notice. It wasn't arrogance, it was just focus. He didn't care about the spectacle. He cared about what came next. I watched as he circled the SUV, his eyes scanning every inch of it. He didn't touch anything right away. He just looked, looking for something, anything that would tell him more about who these guys were and who they worked for. I stood there, my mind racing. My father had just taken down two men, broken them in seconds, and now he was checking the SUV. I wanted to rush in, to find out what he was thinking, to ask questions. But I knew better than that. Frank was thinking ahead, thinking about what might happen next. And right now, it wasn't over. It was just beginning. I could hear the sirens in the distance getting closer. Frank looked up at me briefly, his eyes hard and unreadable. But for a second, I saw something there, something I had only seen once before. It was the look of someone who had been through it all and was ready for whatever came next. And he was ready. Whatever it was, whatever these men had planned, Frank had already thought about it. I wasn't sure if that gave me comfort, or if it made my stomach tighten with dread. Frank didn't say a word to me. He didn't need to. He knew what I was thinking, and I knew what he was thinking. These men weren't just here on some random mission. They were part of something bigger. They were part of a plan. And Frank wasn't about to let that plan unfold without putting a stop to it. I watched him as he bent down and looked through the window of the SUV, peering inside. His face was hard, focused, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition. He didn't reach for the door handle immediately. He just studied everything carefully, almost like he was assembling the puzzle in his mind, figuring out how everything fit together. It didn't take long for the real police to show up. I could see the patrol cars turning the corner, their lights flashing, tires screeching as they came to a halt at the end of the street. I stood there with Ethan, holding him tight, my heart still racing. But Frank didn't flinch. He didn't rush to greet the officers. He just stood there, calm, unshaken, like he had been expecting them the whole time. The officers got out of their cars quickly, hands hovering near their sidearms, clearly on alert. They looked at the two men lying on the ground, and then at Frank. They didn't ask any questions. They didn't need to. It was obvious what had happened. Frank had already handled it. One of the officers, a younger man with a few stripes on his shoulder, came up to Frank and nodded. "We've got this from here," he said. But Frank didn't move. He didn't step back. He stood his ground. "They're not cops," Frank said quietly, his voice still calm but carrying the weight of truth. "They came here to take my grandson. They weren't enforcing anything. They were just imposters, trying to make a quick buck." The officer looked at Frank for a moment, sizing him up, then glanced back at the two men still lying on the ground. The look in his eyes shifted. There was no more questioning, no more doubt. He understood exactly what had happened, and he respected it. "All right, we'll take it from here," the officer said, but Frank just nodded. He didn't need to say more. He had already done what needed to be done. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the scene began to settle. The police took over, securing the two men and starting their investigation. Frank, though, didn't stick around for the details. He turned and walked back toward the porch, his eyes scanning the street one last time, before he disappeared inside. I stood there for a moment, still processing what had just happened. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me was relieved, knowing that Frank had protected us, that we were safe. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. These two men were down, but the people behind them, they were still out there, and they wouldn't forget what had just happened. But for now, Frank had done what no one else could. He'd stopped them, and for that I would be forever grateful. The sirens grew louder, their wail piercing the stillness of the neighborhood. The flashing lights painted everything in a frantic rhythm, but the tension in the air remained. Frank didn't flinch, didn't even turn his head to look. He just stood there, his eyes scanning the street one more time, his arms crossed, as if he were assessing a battlefield. The officers arrived quickly, their patrol cars screeching to a halt, tires kicking up gravel, as they stepped out with hands near their sidearms, eyes darting from the two men lying on the ground to Frank, who was now calmly standing in the yard as if nothing had happened. The first officer, a young man with a few stripes on his sleeve, approached cautiously. He didn't look at the two men on the ground first. He looked straight at Frank. There was an understanding there, a mutual respect that didn't need words. The officer must have realized, just by looking at Frank, that he wasn't someone to be trifled with. He was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The officer's gaze flicked between Frank and the two thugs, still lying there, their hands bound with zip ties. Frank didn't wait for him to say anything. He knew what he needed to do. "They're not cops," Frank said, his voice low but steady. It was a simple statement, but it held weight. The officer nodded, his face unreadable, but he didn't argue. He had seen this before. He knew what was going on. He had the eyes of someone who had been in the field long enough to recognize when a situation had already been handled. The rest of the officers, more relaxed now that the immediate danger had passed, began to approach the men on the ground. They had their own tools, restraint, paperwork, the legal methods of handling criminals, but they knew they were working with the aftermath of a well-calculated action. I watched as the officers took over, moving with efficiency. They weren't questioning Frank. They weren't demanding explanations. They were simply doing their job, now that the threat had been neutralized. There was no panic in the air, no rushed sense of urgency. The moment Frank had stepped out onto the porch, everything had been taken care of. I looked at him again, seeing how calm he still was, how he had handled the entire situation without raising his voice, without showing a hint of anger or fear. It was like this was just another day to him, a day when the world needed protection, and he was there to provide it. I looked down at Ethan, who had been clutching me the whole time. His face was still pale, but his eyes were wide with awe. I could tell he was trying to process everything that had happened. It was hard to make sense of it. How two strangers had come to our house, pretending to be law enforcement, and how quickly everything had turned around. But in the midst of all the chaos, I could see that Ethan wasn't scared. He wasn't trembling or hiding his face in my arms like I might have expected. He was watching Frank, trying to understand what had just unfolded, and I could see the admiration in his eyes. "Grandpa," he whispered, still a little unsure, "how did you do that?" I couldn't help but smile, even though my own mind was racing. "Grandpa's just protecting us," I said softly, brushing his hair back from his forehead. I could feel the weight of everything that had happened, the gravity of the moment, pressing down on my chest. But I also felt a sense of relief. We were safe. Frank had made sure of that. And somehow, as the officers continued their work, Frank's presence alone made me believe we would stay safe. Frank didn't stay with the officers for long. As they moved in to question the two men, to collect evidence, and to get everything documented, Frank just stood back, his hands in his pockets, his eyes never leaving the men on the ground. He wasn't worried about what they would say. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The truth was already there, clear as day. The two men had come to intimidate us, but Frank had taken control, stopped them before they could do anything worse. The scene was unfolding around us, the neighbors starting to gather and murmur among themselves. But Frank remained stoic, unmoved. As the police worked, I could hear the buzz of conversation around us. People were coming out of their homes, some cautiously, others with curiosity painted on their faces. Frank's actions had caught everyone's attention, and I could see the way they looked at him. He wasn't just a man who'd stood up to a couple of thugs. He was something else. He was the protector. And in this moment, in the aftermath of what had just happened, the entire street was beginning to realize it. The police eventually finished their work with the two men, who were now being taken away in handcuffs. But as they were loaded into the squad car, one of the officers walked over to Frank, his expression more respectful now than before. "We'll take it from here," he said, though it was clear he wasn't telling Frank anything new. Frank nodded, accepting the unspoken understanding that the officers would handle the legal side of things. But that didn't mean the job was over for him. He still had one last thing to do. I watched as Frank turned and walked back toward the porch, his eyes scanning the street once more, looking for anything out of place. He wasn't relaxed yet. He wasn't going to let his guard down. I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: pride, relief, but also a creeping sense of worry. We were safe for now, but I knew this wasn't over. These men were just the beginning. Whoever sent them, whoever was behind all of this, was still out there. And Frank knew it. As I stood on the porch, still holding Ethan close, I saw Frank look back over his shoulder at me, his face hard but resolute. "We'll be okay," he said, though it wasn't a reassurance, it was a statement. He had already made up his mind that whatever came next, he would handle it. I didn't argue. I didn't question it. Because with Frank, you didn't need to. I knew he'd do whatever it took to protect us. But for now, there was a strange sense of calm that settled over me. The immediate danger had passed. The men were gone. The police were handling things. And as Frank stood there, a quiet sentinel watching over everything, I knew this was just a moment in a much bigger story, one that was far from over. The calm would only last for so long. We all knew it. And Frank? He was already ready for whatever came next. It wasn't long before the street started buzzing with whispers and questions. People who had been watching from their windows, people who had seen the whole thing unfold, were now coming up to Frank, one by one. They didn't come to praise him, though. They didn't need to. They came to talk, to ask questions, to share their own concerns. They were all beginning to realize that this wasn't just some isolated incident. This was part of something bigger. One man, a neighbor who lived a few doors down, came up to Frank with a slow nod of respect. "Hell of a job, Frank," he said, shaking Frank's hand. "You didn't flinch for a second." Frank didn't respond. He just nodded, accepting the gesture for what it was. He didn't need to explain himself. The message was already clear. And then, someone else came forward. Another neighbor, a woman, started telling Frank about a similar incident at her mother's house the month before, where two men had shown up with clipboards, threatening her with violations she had never heard of. She hadn't reported it at the time, thinking it was just some oddball scam. But now, hearing about what had happened here, she was starting to connect the dots. "You think they're all connected?" she asked Frank, her voice full of concern. Frank looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly, and nodded slowly. "I think it's bigger than just this," he said. "This was just the start." The room began to grow as more people gathered around. They had their own stories, their own questions, and now they were sharing them with Frank. What they didn't know was that Frank had already been thinking about it, already piecing everything together. These two men were just pawns, part of a larger operation that had been targeting families like ours. And Frank wasn't going to let it go. He didn't say much, but I could tell that his mind was already working overtime. This wasn't just about us anymore. This wasn't just about some HOA scam. This was a web of lies, a plan that had been unfolding for far too long. And Frank was going to find out who was behind it, and make sure they paid. As the night went on, and the street returned to its normal rhythm, I felt the weight of the moment settle in. We had made it through. But I knew, deep down, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The fight had started, and Frank was ready for whatever came next.